2021 College Football Rumble. The NCAA football's top 25. And it is definitely a wrestling rumble with so many teams changing places, being thrown or tossed from the top 10 and even the top 25. And this weekend was no different. Hi, everyone. This is Will O'Toole for Park Ridge Sports History, welcoming you to another edition. Last week I focused, and of course, welcome and happy Halloween. I was going to decorate the room in a more festive look, but by the time I got that done, I'd be waiting for the groundhog and the Super Bowl. So I just said, you know what? I'm just going to go as it is. I was actually going to move my locale in front of my fireplace where I have orange and purple lights and pumpkins and all the rest of it. But right now that's being situated by my son who's working on some school. So I said, well, I'll just go back up into the computer room. So I welcome you all, wish you a happy Halloween. And it is a beautiful autumn day. I plan on getting outside and getting some fresh air. But autumn really is a festive time, not just with Halloween, but of course, really Halloween itself, for all of the candy corn and the trick-or-treating and the masks and the witches and the goblins and the full moons. It really signals a very festive occasion within the next 8 weeks. And that is, we're going to have Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, Hanukkah, really a smorgasbord of events, a smorgasbord of festivities. It's a great time to be in America because not only do we have all of these occasions to look forward, but we have the beautiful changing of the leaves. And it seems like down here in Jersey anyway, it seemed like the leaves really started a little bit earlier than normal. Now I would say they are in their most robust with the orange and the golden yellows and the real deep, luscious reds that you remember. And I do very well because I used to spend many Saturdays raking those yellows and golden oranges and luscious reds with my brothers and sisters. But as soon as we got it done, we would always play a football game or do something outside where we would be just basically burning the sun until it was slowly dying over the Watchung Mountains in Essex County. Anyway, welcome. Last week we focused, of course, on the World Series. And that is one thing I do like about October. I was never, I guess you can consider me a baseball traditionalist. I've gone and ranted on about the DH, about maybe the doubleheaders and how we're doing it now, with just the expansion and the changing of teams from one league to another, and really how that's watered down the All-Star game and even the World Series. Yet, I do really appreciate the playoffs because it does really get you through the whole month of October. And it allows you to have really baseball at its finest for the whole month of October. And now, as we know, baseball season with the Braves leading 3-1 as I come into my studio, it could go into November legitimately if, of course, the Astros can somehow pull out Game 5 tonight. That being said, you have all of October for baseball, and you have basically college football at its finest because now we've really met the midpoint of the college football season, where from this stage on, I would say since yesterday, every game is really, really, really meaningful. And you're going to see the pretenders and the contenders come out this week and next week because there is no margin for error. And what I'd like to focus on is the 1977 season because I kind of knew it so well being a Notre Dame fan. And Notre, notice how I say it. It's really Notre Dame. I do the Dick Vitale, Notre Dame. But the Notre Dame season of 1977, I remember I was a senior in high school. I recall that season. Montana's one of its finest there. Dan Devine was at the helm for the Fighting Irish. It was a great football season. But I'd like to talk about the theme I had today with the cartoons, or the cartoon I have today. And that is really how the jostling for position in the top 10, and really specifically now in the top 4, is so crucial. And that 1 week you can be tossed from the ring, but if you can just hang on to the ropes, you can climb back in. And I'm really specifically speaking of Notre Dame, because they were really outside the ropes last week or 2 weeks ago with the loss to Cincinnati. And now they are clinging for life, but at least they still have a chance, unlike other teams. And we're going to talk about that. And why I focus on the 77 season in particular is that Notre Dame finished that year 11-1. And I will tell you this week I'm not using baseball cards. I'm going to use college football covers from Sports Illustrated. I went to the SI Vault and I was able to copy the issues. I remember them all, but I couldn't believe how few of the SI covers dealt with college football. In fact, ready for this? I'm even going to show you the post-1976 season cover when the University of Pitt won the national championship. And then I'm going to show you the previous prediction where they have the college football annual for SI football, where they make their predictions and all the rest of it. But really, ready for this? On that 77 season, if you include the first issue of 1978 for Sports Illustrated, college football made the cover of Sports Illustrated only 4 times from late August to January. So you're talking about maybe 17 weeks. Now you could say, well, that means that they were on the cover once every 4 times. I really thought as a kid that really growing up, you had the NFL and college football. SI always did, let's say, NBA preview, also an NHL preview. They always did a baseball playoff. They did the baseball World Series. They always, put in football, the NFL and all the rest of it, sprinkled that in. Maybe they would do a college basketball issue around Thanksgiving, etc. But I was really taken aback at how few covers were devoted to college football, at least in the 77 season. Here's what I'm going to show you right now. I'll save those 2 for last. On the bottom, this was the 1977 January cover of Sports Illustrated when Pitt, led by Heisman Trophy winner Tony Dorsett, who's right here, his back to the camera, along with the Pitt Panther mascot. They won the national championship that year, defeating Georgia in the Sugar Bowl with relative ease, 27-3. The reason why that cover is so special to me is that was the very first issue of a guy who I actually met. He was from my hometown of Verona, who is actually on this cover. He's the first guy who I knew made the cover of SI, and it was a wide receiver by the name of Willie Taylor. He's in the background here, and I think he was number 29 for the Pitt Panthers, but he played on that team. I think he had a cup of coffee with the Green Bay Packers, but he's in the back here, and I always think that's pretty cool because he did come into, I worked in a gas station with my brothers, the Anderson Getty. It was a great place. And he used to come in for gas. And I remember talking to him about it, and he was very gracious, very humble. I think you start to realize how lucky you are playing on a national championship team. And and you say, were all the injuries, all the breaks, all the dislocations, all the sprains worth it? Well, they probably are when you have that magical national championship ring on your hand, swollen hand, achy hand, an arthritic hand as it is. But he was on the cover. So then fast forward, that's the last time you see college football grace the cover of SI until we get this year. Well, let me just preface that by saying this. First, this was the 1976 cover with Ricky Leach, who was the quarterback for the Michigan Wolverines. And of course, this is when SI was known to have the curse. If they put you on the cover, you would lose. Well, 76, they do pick the Michigan Wolverines to be number 1. Now, the AP poll had Michigan number 2, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But Ricky Leach was a 2-sport athlete at Ann Arbor. He actually played for a while with the Detroit Tigers. I don't know whether he ever got into the pros in the NFL, but he was actually a first baseman. You would think that he might have been a pitcher. He was a left-handed first baseman, a little bit of power. Probably he was one of these guys that was just an unbelievable athlete. And coaches just asked him to come out, and he would play, and he would be the best player on every team. But the problem is, with today's game, it's almost like you have to hone that one skill in that one particular sport in order to make it big time. And for Ricky Leach, who was a very good athlete, excellent athlete. I mean, anytime you can play Division I for both the college football team and the college baseball team at a big-time school, you have to be a heck of an athlete. And Ricky Leach was. Problem was, he just didn't get enough swings, and really his baseball career petered out. I think he lasted maybe 3 years in the Tiger chain. I do remember him playing first base for the Tigers, and I even think his number was 7, but don't hold me to that. So Ricky Leach makes the cover 1976. Now, I didn't get all the covers from the 76 season, but here's who they picked. Here's who finished number 1. Now, here is Notre Dame gracing the cover 1977, and it's great. They even have, but I'm not going to tell you who the address is on the bottom, but this is a subscription magazine of somebody. I think they were from Florida, and Ross Browner is on the cover, and it's basically Wake Up the Echoes. The Irish, it says Wake the Echoes. Of course, that's an allusion to their fight song. And they were actually picked number 1. And I'm going to tell you something. They do finish number 1 that year, defeating Texas and Earl Campbell. But here's where the SI curse comes in. They win their very first game that year, but then their second game, they traveled to Oxford, Mississippi, and were stunned by Ole Miss. And that's where this show comes in. And that is this. I am going to use the Irish of 1977. The Irish of 1977 as kind of, they're an example of the up and down, almost like a stock market. And you're going to be stunned later on in the year that the Irish actually are not elevated after a win over a ranked team, but they actually lose a spot. And we'll get into that in a couple of seconds. But just for the sake of it, I was going to get pictures of, let's say, the big actors of the time, the big coaches of the time in college football. And I think any college football fan who followed any of the big teams, the Alabamas, the USCs, the Notre Dames, actually, when I think about it, of all the teams, Notre Dame probably changed their coaches more times than all the other teams that I remember as a kid. Dan Devine replaced Ara Parseghian. After Parseghian stunned Alabama in the 75 Orange Bowl after beating them for the national championship in the 1973/74 Sugar Bowl that was played on December 31st, 1973. As I've stated here before, I would love to go over that. There were so many lead changes in that 73 Sugar Bowl. It is one of the great games of all time that nobody ever talks about. Now, there were a ton of fumbles and turnovers, but that just added to the drama of the game. Was it well played? It really was. What people forget, it was played on a slick surface, not in a driving rainstorm, but in a consistent rain. And it ended with a Bob Thomas field goal, putting the Irish up 24-23. And then I shouldn't say that. That was the last of the scoring. And then Bear Bryant gets the ball at midfield and has a 4th down and elects to punt the ball to the Irish and bottles them up at the 2-yard line. And the Irish go nowhere on the first 2 plays. And then Tom Clements hits an unbelievable bomb to Robin Weber. Where this came from, I'll never know. Weber, I think that might have been his only catch or his second catch on the year. But it was drama. And, of course, then Notre Dame doesn't take a knee. They actually run the ball. All right, that's how the game has changed so much today. And you say to yourself, why didn't they do it then? It was just one of those things. It takes somebody with some innovation to say, listen, I won the game. All I have to do is run out the clock. Let me just run back and take a knee. And so the Irish won the national championship in 73. All right. Fast forward to 77, and the Irish are up and they are predicted to win another championship. The problem is, after defeating number 7 Pitt in the first game, 16-6, they go down to Ole Miss and lose 17-13. So they go. All right. I'm going to say this. The Irish, let me just tell you this. They started the 1-0. They started the season, and I want to thank Football Reference for this. The only problem with the Football Reference, it's a shame. They haven't been able to locate or put up yet, and I'm hoping that they do. No criticism of the site. It's wonderful. I've actually emailed the editor. He's just great, and he does listen. It's a matter of maybe getting the stats and getting permission to put them up. But Notre Dame started the season as the number 3 team. The AP, of course, that year had, I'm just going to give you this. The AP had Notre Dame number 3 and Oklahoma number 1. And of course, here they are. They're gracing this cover, beating Ohio State later on in October. Anyway, Notre Dame starts the season as the number 3 team. Then they lose. And Notre Dame moves or is pushed to number 11. Let me just get this right here. They go all the way. They plummet to number 11 on the AP top 25, or actually it was the top 20 then. Boom, they lose 8 spots. And as a kid, I do remember this. I remember my brothers telling me, you know, they still have a shot because they lost early. It's not going to be easy. They can't lose another game because it was, if you lost 2, you were done. And then you were playing hopefully for like the Blue Bonnet, or maybe you might catch a break and be somebody, you know, one of the power teams fodder in the Orange Bowl, like happened to Notre Dame in the 72 season when they got squashed by Nebraska in the Orange Bowl, losing 40-6. But anyway, they plummet to number 11. Ready for this? They win their next game over Michigan State. Now you have to remember this. They played Michigan State and Purdue. As a kid, I just remember them always playing those 2 teams. Purdue used to give them fits. And for a while there, I even think I mentioned this on a previous show, Mike Phipps, I believe, was the only quarterback to ever defeat Notre Dame 3 straight times when he was at Purdue. Of course, then he becomes a draft pick for the Cleveland Browns and has a modicum of success with the Brownies. But they were a real thorn in the side, Purdue, for Notre Dame when I was growing up. They play Michigan State, and of course, I'm going to devote one show later on to that 66 game, and you're going to see how there's a lot of myth about that game. And Notre Dame is, and yes, I am a Notre Dame fan, and I've always felt, though, they took too much criticism in that game. And I'll save that for another day because I don't want to go off on another tangent. With Michigan State, they plummet to number 14 after their win over Purdue. They come into the Michigan State game, they're 14th ranked. They beat Michigan State 16-6. They play Army and beat them 24-0 for one of their first 2 shutouts that year. They beat the Black Knights of the Hudson, and they came into that game ranked number 11. Now comes the big game, USC. Now, in all my years, the only time Notre Dame had ever defeated the Trojans was in the year that they would win the national championship. All the other years that I recall growing up, they lost. They won in 73 when Eric Pennick ran off a monster 85-yard run to really give the Irish a big lead that the Trojans were never able to come back. And they win the national title. I believe they won in 66. Actually, I know they do because they went out to SC and just destroyed the Trojans 51-0 in a game that McKay was outraged on. And he said that would never happen again. And every time he used to dominate Notre Dame, but really did stick it to them every once in a while. Can you say Anthony Davis, 24-0 right before half, running a touchdown back on a kickoff, and then the Trojans scoring like 55 unanswered points in 1974 to defeat the Irish? So, yeah, that payback was tough on the Irish. But that's what I recall. And then they win in 73, the national title, and beat SC. They win in 66 and win the national title. Well, here's 77. And I do recall, this is the age before ESPN and Fox Sports and all these other cable outlets where this game, and even Notre Dame's own network, NBC, the Notre Dame network as it is. So this game was televised. I just didn't see it. I'd gone to my school's football game, but my brother Jim had stayed home, and we felt good about the game. But this was the game that Dan Devine decides in pregame to really psych up the Irish. He's going to don green uniforms, and they become the uniform for the rest of the year. Those green uniforms. Here they are. Just want to show you. Now, this is the white one. The green ones are definitely cool. But those green uniforms, my brother told me, because he watched the entire game, so psyched up, one, the crowd, so psyched up the coaching staff, and more importantly, so psyched up the Irish football players, and that they just throttled USC. And in fact, they defeat them 49 to 19. In fact, this was the big help for Notre Dame that year. Just slam basting Georgia Tech 69-14 and Miami 48-10 and Air Force 49-0. Really, this showed you that they were a legit team that year, because not only do they do that to the Trojans, who were number 5 in the nation at the time, beat them by 30 points, albeit at home, I understand, but they would do that later on to Texas in the Cotton Bowl. They never let up, never let off the neck of Texas and the Longhorns in the Cotton Bowl. So anyway, they defeat USC, which was ranked number 5. Here's how crazy this thing is. And this is why I'm saying this is like Notre Dame in 1977. They're holding on. You know, they get thrown out. Anybody who watches WWE will tell you that you can get thrown out, but if you manage to hang on in some of these matches and your feet don't touch the ground and manage to pull yourself back in, you're still in the match. Well, Notre Dame, as we go forward today, is still in the match. Now, I haven't seen the top 25 yet, but winning last night over North Carolina was a big help. They did take a hit, and I'll talk about that in a second. They took a huge hit, and so did Cincinnati, and I want to get into that in a second. But they defeat USC, and they basically do this. USC, Notre Dame actually moves up 6 spots, and they come into the Navy game on October 29th as the 5th-ranked team. How bad was it for USC? Well, they went from number 5, okay? They went from number 5, and they dropped to the 10th spot. Amazing, right? So they're still kind of in it. Now, Notre Dame goes and they basically throttle Navy. All right? They beat Army. They beat Navy. Now, for all those naysayers, and I used to remember this, that there were a lot of people who are anti-Notre Dame fans, anti-Irish. You know, they put it this way. If you root for Notre Dame, more than likely, many, many times you're rooting for the Yankees, or you might be rooting for the Celtics or the Lakers. You know, they have that kind of reputation that they're followed by fair weather friends. But they have a huge subway alumni, as we are called. People who are Irish Catholic and rooted for them, people from the East Coast. One thing about Newt Rockne, ironically, who was not a Catholic, was that he he had expert marketing. And that's why he actually initiated the football games with SC, because he gave his players a chance to go out, bathe in the nice Southern California sun late in autumn. But he also made his team national, and he would always play on the East, whether it would be Army, whether it be a Yankee Stadium game against another team, and they would play at the neutral site of either Yankee Stadium. Sometimes they played at Shea, the Polo Grounds. They did play one game, I believe, at Ebbets Field. And, of course, they used the Meadowlands. And I'm calling it the Meadowlands. I'm not going to break it down to the other names for the stadium. Everyone knows here in New Jersey what I'm talking about, especially Bergen County. It's just the Meadowlands. Anyway, Notre Dame went down. They went into the Navy game, and they were ranked number 5 in the country. And they did what they were supposed to do. They throttled Navy. All right, 43-10. In fact, Navy that year, unfortunately, I think Navy was 5-6. Not bad, but it's not Roger Staubach Navy, but still pretty good. In fact, just a uh, just the segue to that, Notre Dame played teams that were 65, 55, and 4 that year. So they were 10 games over 500. And why I say that is this: Notre Dame on their schedule actually played 4 ranked teams. Now, everyone gets on this, that they always played Army, Navy, and Air Force. And that's where I'm segueing again. Well, I was doing some research on that. Since Air Force has had a team since the 59 season, to have all 3 teams on the ledger, now you're talking about 63 years of football at Notre Dame. Do you realize that they only played all 3 military academies 8 times? Now, when I was a kid, here's the deal. In 69, they played all 3. In 73, they played all 3. And in 77 and 80, they played all 3. Now I'm after college, 83, and they played them once. They played them in 83 and 85. Then they waited 10 years to 95. They haven't played all 3 military academies since 2006. All right. So that was always the knock against Notre Dame, that they would play the 3 military academies, and that's why they always had a high seeding and all the rest of it. Okay. 8 times it happened. They would always play Navy, but that was a rival. And of course, they initiated with the Air Force. They've had some real good battles with them. In fact, Air Force, at a point, in the late 80s, when they had really good teams under Fisher DeBerry and Ken Hatfield, they used to beat Notre Dame. Okay. So good teams. I'm not saying they are world beaters, but tell me this. At the time, was Northwestern any better than Army, Navy, or Air Force? I'd say this, that Northwestern didn't have a winning team since like 1963 when Ara Parseghian left, or Alex Agassi left. He was their coach in 70. I think they were 6-4. Navy potentially played for a national title in the Cotton Bowl, losing to Texas, albeit they had Roger Staubach, that once-in-a-generation player that comes to the academies. But Army had a history of good football teams winning national championships. And Air Force, as a kid, I used to root for them. I remember them going to the Sugar Bowl as a 10-1 team. They got throttled by Tennessee. So you can see it was kind of like Tennessee, the big-time team, playing maybe a mid-major. But still, they got there. And they played on New Year's Day, which is really it's a get for the the lesser schools. So it wasn't like Michigan or the Oklahomas and stuff were really packing their schedule with powers from the Big Ten or the Pac-8. And now, as I say that, I got to take that back, because Oklahoma in 77 does play Ohio State. But for years, I used to hear that, and I'm saying, well, wait a minute, they're not that bad. I'm not saying they were great, but they're no worse than Northwestern. They're no worse than Rice. They were no worse than Vanderbilt. No worse than, believe me, Oregon and Oregon State stunk when I grew up. California has not been to the Rose Bowl since 59. All right. So it was no worse than that. And I'm just going to get up on my soapbox and kind of defend Notre Dame's schedule there. Anyway, they beat Navy. And as you can see, Ross Browner makes the cover, and he does win one of the defensive awards that year. Notre Dame really had a good defense. Ready for this? They only allowed 20 points twice. And that was to Ole Miss, the game that they lost, in Jackson, Mississippi. I always thought they played in Oxford, Mississippi. I probably may move to a bigger site. And then Purdue, they beat 31-24 at Purdue. After that, the most points that Notre Dame surrenders is 19 to SC. And that, I did see that game. SC kind of scores late. It was more like they just, play the prevent. Let's just get the game over. Let them chew out clock and all the rest of it. So that game was really like 49-12 or 49-13. I think they went for 2 and missed it, something like that. But Notre Dame, from September 24th, never gave up more than 19 points in a game. In fact, ready for this? They gave up fewer than 10 or 10 or fewer. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times they limited their opponents to 10 or fewer points. And it was led by Ross Browner, who does win one of the defensive awards that year, and another guy who I used to love. He was number 20. He was a cornerback. His name was Luther Bradley. I loved him. He probably had to be my favorite player on the defense. And of course, they had a couple of guys on the offense. I always confuse their names. Ready for this? Vegas Ferguson. And Vegas Ferguson. And let me just see if I can see this again here. Jarvis, wait a minute, and Vegas Ferguson and Jerome Havens, or Jerome Heavens, okay? They were their two big running backs on that team, even though neither graced the cover of SI that year. It was Terry Urick. I remember that, and he had a pretty good career too. Never an NFL player or anything like that. Anyway, let's get back. I'm going off on the deep end. Then Notre Dame plays Georgia Tech, and they have their biggest offensive display all year, 69-14. They just drill Georgia Tech, okay, who was independent at that time. In fact, ready for this? This is going to floor you. I think there's a handful, maybe there's 6 to 8 teams that are independents now, including Army and Notre Dame, who went back to being that way. Back then, there were 36 independents. Incredible. All right, before all the conferences. Anyway, Notre Dame plays a future ACC opponent and Georgia Tech, who would join the ACC. Ready for this? Here's late in the season. They play a ranked team, Clemson, ranked 15th in the country. And the interesting thing is this. They beat Clemson, narrowly escaping in Clemson, Death Valley, with the big Frank Howard rock and all the rest of it, and the orange and the purple and stuff. Still love their helmet. It's a great helmet. They beat them 21-17. And in fact, ready for this? Clemson, after that game, really do not survive. Anyway, Clemson had gone into that game 7-1-1. They tie North Carolina, or prior to the game with Notre Dame. They lose to Notre Dame. They beat South Carolina, and this is what helps Notre Dame. They lose to Pitt in, I believe, the Gator Bowl. They were throttled by Pitt in the Gator Bowl. Now, why that was such a big deal is because Pitt was also one of the opponents for Notre Dame early in the year, and they beat them by 10. All right? So now you're starting to say, maybe as a voter, well, the 4 points, it's because it was. By the way, here's another thing. Ready for this? Notre Dame beat Pitt on the road, ranked number 7. Of course, they beat SC at home when they were ranked number 5. They beat Clemson, number 15, on the road late in the year. And Clemson had a fine team that year, and they would be building towards 1981 or the 80-81 season when they would win the national title. Anyway, because of Notre Dame, they actually lost 2 of their last 3 games. And the 2, as I said, it was to a mutual opponent, and that was Pitt. So they finished 8-3-1, and they fall to 19th in the country. Now Notre Dame moves. Here's the thing. Figure this out. They beat Clemson in Clemson, which was ranked number 15. They had beaten SC when they were ranked 11th, and they go and they defeat USC and move all the way up to 5th. Now they played Clemson, were ranked 5th, beat them in Clemson, a ranked team, 21-17. The next week they play Air Force, and they're ranked 6. They dropped the spot after playing a ranked team. After beating Air Force 49-0, they move back up to number 5. And then they go to Miami and throttle the Hurricanes 48-10. Now, they weren't vintage Hurricane teams. I think they finished the season 5-6 as well. And now that was December 3rd, 1977. That's a big deal too, because that was basically the last week of the season. And Notre Dame put such a hurt on Miami. And of course, Notre Dame was free. And this, all these teams that complain about Notre Dame finishing high in the rankings and all the rest of it. Well, Notre Dame never played in bowl games up until 1970. When they started playing, they were basically, wined and dined to go to these other, because every one of these conferences that sponsored the Cotton Bowl was was the Southwest Conference. The Sugar Bowl was the Southeast. The Orange Bowl was the Big Eight. Of course, they were locked out of the Rose Bowl. And then you had, I'm trying to think of any other major bowls. Well, Fiesta would become kind of like the WAC Bowl. Arizona State would play in it for a while. But you know what I'm saying? You'd have those four major bowls, even though the Peach and the Sun Bowl have long histories as well. They just never were able to get up there. Anyway, make a long story short, Notre Dame is being wined and dined. Now they put the hit on Miami 48-10. It was, ready for this, 5 of their last 6 games, Notre Dame had scored 40 or more points, being led by Joe Montana. They were putting a hurt on everybody, and they were available because they were not fettered to a bowl game. So they were wined and dined. Everybody wanted to play them. And they always used to say, I remember my dad telling me this as a kid, they always wanted to play a higher seeded team. They would always go and play the higher seeded team. Well, there they were. Texas with future Heisman Trophy candidate and a great, great, great football player, Earl Campbell. We're just sitting there and waiting in Dallas for them. And Notre Dame accepts the bid. Now, Notre Dame is 5th going into that game, ranked 5th. But I remember watching that game, and it was not played on New Year's Day. It was actually played the next day because New Year's was on a Sunday that year in 78. 78. So they played on Monday. I just remember that. And I just knew, you just know when you're watching the game. And it was all about Earl Campbell. And I knew it was. And sometimes you just know what the strategy is. I mean, it's so basic. And it's so plain as day that you can't forget. And Dan Devine was like this. We'll give up the 150 yards to Earl Campbell. We're just going to stop everything else. And we're just going to, play great defense on everything else. Well, sure as anything, Notre Dame got off to an early lead. And I think they got off to like a 10 or 17-point lead. And the problem with Texas is that they were 85 to 90% running, with 80% of the running being done by Campbell. Notre Dame couldn't stop Campbell, but they stopped the rest of the team. In fact, it was Rory McKay. I want to give his name the right way. He was a running quarterback as well. In fact, statistically, Randy McEachern, all right, he actually played 10 games, and he only threw the ball 89 times the whole year at 45 completions. So they were just giving it to Earl Campbell. And Campbell ran for 267 attempts that year, ran for over 1,700 yards, 6.5 average, 18 touchdowns. In fact, Campbell had 18. They had a total of 1, 3, 5, 10, 12, 19, 37 touchdowns on the ground, and he had 18 of them. Notre Dame stopped the rest of the team, basically dominated, and when push came to shove, the Irish absolutely dominated Texas 38-10. Now, this is New Year's Day. Here's what had to go right. I forgot to tell you this. All along the line, you have a couple of other teams, and now I know I only have about 4 minutes left, but I've always said this. Lou Holtz didn't win one national championship for the Irish. He actually won 2. That year, Lou Holtz decides, the year that Notre Dame goes up and down and up and down, and they're 5th. He goes into, ready for this, he goes into that season with the 70s, his first at Arkansas after leading the North Carolina State Wolfpack. And they were 7-4-1. That Arkansas team, he comes over. And in his first year with the Razorbacks, okay, he wasn't even in the rankings at the very beginning of the year. But he took his team, ranked number 6, one spot behind the Irish, and he beat the number 2 team, Oklahoma, which opened the gate for Notre Dame to really jump up. And we've seen this where they were, ranked 11th and 14th and then jump up with the SC game. They went from 11th to 5th. All right. And on that night, ready for this? Alabama. In fact, Arkansas only lost to Texas and that year, and they lost to Texas 13-9. So you couldn't, as a voter, really put Arkansas number one, even though they were still behind the Irish in the poll, because they had lost to the team that both had played against, and Notre Dame throttled Texas, and they knew they would probably have to throttle them. The other big game that day, Alabama destroyed Ohio State 35-6. Here's the deal. Ready for this? In the preseason, it was Oklahoma, Michigan, Notre Dame, USC, Ohio State, Alabama, Pitt, Texas Tech, Texas A&M, and Maryland, who were the preseason top 10. The season finished this way. Washington was ranked 10, followed by Michigan, which had gotten beat in the Rose Bowl. They were destroyed by Washington, which was only 7-4 going into that game. Pitt, which beat Clemson and lost to Notre Dame, finished 8th. Oklahoma plummeted all the way to 7th. Kentucky, a surprise team that year in the SEC, they finished 7th. Penn State, which was ranked 13th going into the preseason, or 13th, finished number 6. Texas, which had no ranking that year, finished 5th. And Arkansas, which assists Notre Dame in winning the national title, throttling Oklahoma in the Orange Bowl, finishes 4th. Third rather. Alabama finished 2nd, and Notre Dame finished 1st. And the reason why I say this is that they still have a very outside shot. Now, what hurt them last night was SMU losing to Houston, because that would have been the last ranked team Cincinnati plays. So Cincinnati, we had said this before, has to run the full gamut, but that hurts them on their potential way or road to getting to the playoffs. Hope you enjoyed this little bit of 1977, the chaos in the top 20 poll college football. This is Will O'Toole, thanking all of you for joining me for Park Ridge Sports History. Shout out to Howard Fred. Bye now.